And so we're going to skip ahead and turn to Wayne Paulson, who'll be at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. He'll be talking about bottom trawl surveys and the Aleutians and characterization of demersal fish and invertebrate populations.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, organizers and attendees, for coming out to this Aleutian Life Forum. And I really appreciate this forum for me to be able to convey to you some information that NOAA has been collecting since 1980 and conducting surveys out here in the Aleutian Islands. So the main purpose of my talk is to talk to you about that survey and describe some of the data products. So my name is Wayne, and I am the team leader for the Aleutian Islands and Gulf of Alaska Bottom Trawl Survey Group. I lead about 10 scientists who conduct the survey and also do associated research. So I'm going to talk to you a lot about the survey, and then I'm going to talk to you about some of the data products that come out of that survey. And what I talked to Matt about doing is actually incorporating a talk that I was going to give on Friday into this, which really focuses more on the data products that we deliver. So I'm going to try to do some welding here between two talks, so you have to pardon me for that. So I'll go a little bit over 15 minutes, but there'll be an efficiency there, so that's what we'll try to do. So bottom trawl surveys. What is a bottom trawl? It's a net that rides over the seafloor. It's held open by two doors that act like kites to keep the spread open. And it's, for us as scientists, it's really a crude microscope to tell us what's on the seafloor. And if we can do this technique consistently over the years, we can at least use it as a relative trend of how things are changing on the seafloor. So it's pretty broad scale. And we tow this from a commercial fishing boat. And let's see if we can get... And before I get going, we've mentioned a couple species names already of some of the groundfish species that we target during these surveys, but I just wanted to kind of go over the cast of characters in case you're not familiar with the species that are some of the primary species that are encountered in the Aleutian Islands. First is the pollock, Alaska pollock, walleye pollock. The next is Pacific cod. They're on the right. They get pretty big out there in the western Aleutians. Then Atka mackerel, we've heard that name already. It's a favorite prey item of the sea lions, so Atka mackerel, very colorful fish, schooling species. There's a host of flatfishes. This is a flathead sole, but you're also probably most familiar with Pacific halibut, but there's rock soles and other things like that that live on the seafloor. And then very abundant, the rockfishes, particularly Pacific Ocean perch, which is a rockfish, but they're really one of the most abundant species, as I'll show you in the Aleutians. And then we also capture invertebrates during our surveys, like king crabs, not many of them, frankly, and also corals, sponges, and a whole host of invertebrates. During this last survey that we just finished last Friday, just got off the boat, we encountered over 100 different kinds of fish and several hundred different kinds of invertebrates. So it's pretty amazing diversity that we encounter. Now, we do bottom trawl surveys actually throughout Alaska, and I'm going to talk mostly about the Aleutian Islands, but we conduct surveys in the even years on the Aleutian Islands, so this year. In the odd years, my team works in the Gulf of Alaska, and there's kind of a disjunct between, let's see if I can get a pointer here going. That's not going to work. But when you go out to the island of the Four Mountains, during the Aleutian survey year, we only sample the Bering Sea side. On the Gulf year, we sample the Pacific side from Unimak Pass to the island of Four Mountains. So that part has been traditionally part of the Gulf of Alaska assessment and still is. But we do cover that in the odd years. Every year, there is a survey that is conducted in the green here on the eastern Bering Sea shelf. Then they're planning to push north into the North Bering Sea every other year. And every other year, they survey the Bering Sea slope, and that's this year as well. They just finished that survey. And occasionally, the Chukchi Sea and the Beaufort Sea have been surveyed using bottom trawls. So it's a tool that's been used quite a bit. It is really since the late 70s, early 80s, depending upon where you are, and it's really provided fisheries managers and scientists a good baseline for what's going on in each of these ecosystems. So the purpose of the survey is to continue that 36-year standardized time series. We're trying to estimate at least relative abundance, look at the distribution of animals over time, and learn something about the biological condition of key stocks. And as Matt mentioned, The Aleutian Islands are managed part of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands complex, and when you look at that, there are 31 managed species or species groups that include either the managed species or ecosystem species. So we don't just look at the important stocks like pollock, we also look at a few of the forage species and things like that, so we have a balanced approach. Now to kind of delve into what we do during the survey, we get started here in Dutch Harbor in early June, and we contract 2 vessels, and they work out over a 70-day period to Stalemate Bank. That's about 90 miles to the west of Attu Island. I like to say that we're so far west that we're actually east. We conduct really the latter third of the survey in the eastern hemisphere. So it's quite a bit of a distance. It's 930 nautical miles out that far. So we come back then in mid-August, early August, mid-August, and finish the survey. It's a pretty extensive survey effort. It's there's a lot of effort that goes into their survey. We've tried to keep it as standardized as possible since the early 80s. Since in 1980 we conducted what was called a systematic survey. We went from Dutch Harbor or Unimak Pass on to the west every 20 nautical miles, where we try to set our net, identify where there was trawlable habitat that was smooth enough for us to successfully tow our trawl. And we had the participation of the Japanese Research Institute at the time in the first 2 years of the survey. Tow durations were 30 minutes to an hour. So, and the nets did differ. The Japanese used a lot larger bottom trawl than we use today. But over time, in 1990 and 1991, we standardized our nets. We just used American researcher fisheries vessels, and we started to really ratchet down and get very specific standardized data. We also changed in 1997 from a longer tow duration to a 15-minute tow duration that seemed to made a lot more sense in terms of volume and handling fish. And since the 2000s, we've targeted conducting over 400 stations throughout the Aleutians. You can see, though, that some of that survey effort has varied, and in 2008, we did not do a survey due to funding limitations. The general survey design is, again, 2 commercial fishing vessels. When we use commercial fishing vessels, guess what? Commercial fishermen really know how to fish and make efficient work of setting the trawl 4 to 6 times a day. The vessels need to be at least 120 feet in length, have 1,500 horsepower to pull a research net. Typically, these vessels have captain and cook and deckhands, fishermen and engineers, 5 to 6 people of those. And then we put on a team of 6 scientists to process the catch. Over time, we've identified about 1,000 places where we can successfully tow our nets, and we do a subsampling of those in a stratified stratified random manner. We've identified 45 different strata or areas or zones determined either by the 4 depth zones that you see here or by geography. Those pretty much we correspond to the fisheries management regions, and I'll show you that in a second. We allocate those stations over the Aleutian chain based on the stratum area, the abundance of the catch, and the variability, and we try to do this on an average basis over the most important economic species. And as I said, we do now 15-minute tows that covers a distance of about 1.5 kilometers or a half or 3/4 of a nautical mile. And we're using what we call poly nor'easter net. And these are the strata and the major regions. Southern Bering Sea, the northern side, as I said, not the southern side from Unimak Pass to the Island Four Mountains, and the eastern, central, and western Aleutians. And most of those are divided between the Bering side and the Pacific side, and then by those 4 depth zones. Just might note that in the central Aleutian Islands, we have an additional stratum that covers Petrel Bank, which is its kind of own unique productive system. And this is the net that we use. It's a modified commercial net. It ranges in mesh size from 5 inches in the wings to only 1.25 inches in the cod end. We have sensors on this net that monitor the performance during the tow. So we measure how wide an area the net is sweeping. We call that the wing spread. We also measure how high the net is fishing off the seafloor. It's usually about 7 meters, where a wing spread's about 16 meters. And we can also measure where the depth of the head rope and whether or not the foot rope of the net is actually making contact with the seafloor, which was an assumption that we always have. So we actually have sensors on the net that tells us that. And also speed. We're towing the net at a speed of 3 knots when we set it, when we tow it, and then when we retrieve it, so that the net maintains its fishing configuration. Once everything comes on board, we have a system of processing all the animals. We want to identify what they are. We want to weigh them. The most important attribute that we do is usually in terms of weight, and count them. And then we have a system that, for the important species and species of interest, we'll take further subsample them. We'll take length observations, determine gender. For particularly the managed species, we'll take age structures, the little ear bones called otoliths that lay down bone on an annual basis, just like the rings of a tree. We may look at their diets. You saw some of the results in Matt's talk about these predator-prey linkages. A lot of that is based on the diet observations from our surveys. We may take life history samples like gonads, ovaries, to look at maturity rates, look at growth rates. We are always keeping an eye out for rare or undiscovered species. And particularly for the invertebrates, there's been a whole wealth of identifying new corals and sponges that really people from around the world are looking at our samples to do that. But also we get rare fishes or undiscovered species. For example, in the last 20 years, several managed species like rock soles and some of the rockfishes have had cryptic species where we thought we had 1 species or actually 2 species or even 4 species in the case of the sand lances. So that becomes pretty information, and we're just really still trying to describe the ecosystem. We also take environmental data. We have a temperature and depth sensor riding the net, and also a light meter. And when we're out there, Matt mentioned the ES60 sonar system. We have one of those on the boats, and we're constantly collecting sonar data so that we may be able to use that to determine seafloor hardness, and we have a study going on that right now. For data uses, most of it is really focused to supplying information to the stock assessment scientists at NOAA who are helping to manage the species for the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. That is really one of the primary things that we do, but really we do incorporate basic biology like where these fish occur, how does that change over time. The primary use of the data is to use an independent source to confirm the trends that the stock assessment scientists are often deriving from catch, commercial catch, and the age structure of that commercial catch, along with mortality rate information, fishing rate information. They're making stock assessments and modeling the population. Well, the question is does that modeled population agree with the trends that we're seeing from the survey? And that's one of the major uses of our survey data, as well as getting that size and age structure from the survey. I'm going to touch on some of these other things in the talk I'm going to weld here in just a few minutes, but I'll just let you know this is primarily what we catch. This is the average species composition from the last few surveys that we've conducted. And you can see that rockfishes as a group is the most dominant catch that we get. And of those rockfish, it's that Pacific Ocean perch. Probably 60% of that rockfish figure is Pacific Ocean perch. So that's really an abundant and major source of our catch. But Atka mackerel as a single species is second most, and then pollock, and then the flatfish complex, Pacific cod, and then all the other fish combined as a group. So just give you a sense of what we actually catch out there and see on our trawls. Now, as I said, we want to really estimate density of how thick the fish are on the seafloor. And because we measure net width, that 16 meters on average that the net's fishing, and we're very precisely measuring when the trawl hits the seafloor and comes off the seafloor, we can measure distance. Distance times width is area. And so we can relate the poundage of fish that we get to that area and get a density, how many fish per acre there is on the seafloor. And if you do that enough times, you get a good average, good survey science, and then you can multiply that average density times the total area of the seafloor that we get from maps and come up with a rough population estimate. That's a whole simple-minded idea of doing these surveys. So we can actually say that there's with caveats that there's 10,000 pounds of fish of this species Y in this stratum, and then use that to compare to the stock assessments. That's kind of what we're after. And for Pacific Ocean perch, when these data get turned over to the stock assessment scientists, they'll look at commercial catch, and this is the catch history here of Pacific Ocean perch. It went really high in the 60s and 70s and declined. Well, that black line is the modeled population based on that commercial catch and the age structure and other things. And we really want to see if that black line coincides with our survey data. So those points, those dots with the error bars on them are the data since 1990. And by and large, the trend is confirmed. POP have been increasing since the 90s, and so have the abundance estimates from our survey. And moreover, the black line coincides more or less with those error bars, so that we're in the right ballpark in doing both our survey and doing the stock assessment, the modeled catch. So that's good news. That's what we want to see. There are limitations to the survey data. This is a multi-species survey. Has a lot of advantages, perhaps, for looking at ecosystems, looking at different species, how they might be changing over time. But it's not designed for any one species. And there are other surveys, like the halibut longline survey and the sablefish longline survey, that are really tuned to looking at one species. So by looking at a bunch of species, you might be compromising where we put our sampling effort and maybe not get the best estimate for any particular species. There's also an issue about the vulnerability of the survey. Rockfish, rocks. We don't tow our net successfully over rock piles. So we may substantially be underestimating some of the rockfish species. Not all of them necessarily, but some of them. So that creates a bias potentially in interpreting our survey data. And this is a broad view tool. It's for looking at what the abundance is over broad regions. So when you look at specific sites, it may not be the tool for you to use in looking at that specific. Yeah, so I'm going to switch talks now, okay? Yeah. See if we can do this.
Just hit escape.
Yeah. And let's see if what I'm going to do is on Friday I was going to give a talk more about some of the data products that the survey has that people might be interested in. And what I'm going to try to do is to give that talk now, but not repeat the information I just told you. So I've talked already about the data uses. I'm going to focus a little bit more on some of the other products from the survey. This is a distributional map of Pacific Ocean perch over time that you can find in the SAFE document. And the SAFE document is produced every year. It's the stock assessment and fishery evaluation document that the stock assessment scientists produce for the SSC and for the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. We have data reports for our own surveys. They're available online, and I'll show the website for that. You can also download the catch rate data that I just spoke about for each of the species through the Alaska Fisheries Science Center website. And we also have a tool called the Survey Mapper that's available on the site. So that's actually an example for, again, Pacific Ocean perch for 2014, where we observe Pacific Ocean perch along the Aleutian chain. And you can vary the thresholds for how much catch you're seeing in the year, so you can use that slider bar on the lower left-hand corner to look at the time trend just in raw distribution over time. That's available online that folks can use. And yeah, here's an example of the distributional map. If you download the density data and have the right tools, you can really tear apart how fish abundances and distributions have changed. Like in the early 90s, as I said, it was kind of a low point of the population, and over time you can see that there's higher and higher densities as you get down to 2014. So that's, you can kind of see, you would see that in the data survey mapper, but when you get the data and start to explore them yourself, there's all kinds of things you can look at. And for each of the managed species, the stock assessment scientists will have a similar kind of graph in their SAFE document. So you can just, it's already been done. I talked about this graph already. And this is an example of the kinds of age structure that we get when we take the otoliths, they get aged in our aging lab, and then the stock assessment scientist applies that age structure to the population. You can see the cohorts of fish march through the populations over time. Is that showing? It's not showing. But you can see the strong year classes, as they grow older in each of the surveys, you see them as older individuals, and they're less frequent. That's just part of the demographic natural mortality thing going on. But that's a major tool for stock assessment scientists who are looking at the age structure and the demography of the population. And as I said, the stocks and the Aleutians are managed with the Bering Sea, but this is actually a good news chart here. This is showing what the 2016 biomass estimate is compared to its maximum or most sustainable level of fishing. And the idea here is you don't want to be in the upper left-hand corner, period. You don't want to be in the left-hand margin in the orange, and you don't want to be up above. Those define the overfishing and overfished levels of the population. These are defined by a stock assessment criteria for the national standards. And the good news is for the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands is all of these populations are in the green. They're in a sustainable framework. They're not being overfished, and that's good news. So you can find that in the introduction of the SAFE document for 2015. It'll be published again in 2016 and comes out every year. I just want to touch on a couple of special projects. So I've talked about fish and invertebrate biodiversity already. One thing, as I said earlier, was we have a temperature sensor on our net, so when we're out fishing, we know what the temperature is on the seafloor and at the sea surface and through the water column. And we take that data every year or for every survey and process it. We actually have to model it and kind of look at the midpoint of our survey because just naturally, because it's summertime when we do these surveys, water temperatures are slowly increasing. So we model it to a standardized date in the middle of the survey in July. And we can then look at the heat map, surface down to the seafloor of the Aleutians. This goes, on each of these charts, it goes from Stalemate Bank out to back to Unimac Pass on the right. And you can see, just taking a step back, 1997 was a big El Nino year, and it was warmer, particularly on the surface in the Aleutians when we did our survey. In 2014, we had the warm blob starting in the Gulf, but really the ocean temperatures were already warmer in the Aleutians on the surface. And also, if you look in the middle depths as well, similar pattern to 1997, but it was a lot warmer in the middle part of the water column. So we have that. We can compare that to how our catches, catch rates and how that might be affecting fish distributions. And not so much for the Aleutians, but right now there's a lot of interest in how the warm blob affected fish abundance and distributions that's going on, looking at climate change as a example of how climate change might be affecting fish distributions. And that's being focused mostly from the Gulf of Alaska all the way down to California. A couple of studies going on the warm blob funded by NPRB. We've mentioned Mark Zimmerman's name, and Matt will be talking a little bit more about some of this, but Mark is one of the scientists that we work with, and he's been using data that has been around for a long time in some cases. He's using smooth sheets that NOAA hydrographers has collected over the last century. And when you look at a nautical chart, you'll see depth readings. In fact, when those depths were recorded, about 10 times more data were collected. And these actually got digitized way back a couple decades ago and have been available. And Mark's been taking them and proofing them. And he has composed a new bathymetry, the depth gradient for the Aleutians. And he published that a couple years ago, but now he has a new NPRB project where he's looking at collecting new information and teasing out all soundings. The soundings are pretty good, but when you get to the near shore, they're not very good. When there's new data available from a modern multi-beam bathymetry, he can incorporate those data into his model. There's sediment data, which he's collected for the Aleutian Islands and put out in his coverage. But the shorelines are pretty ill-defined, so he's going to be really working on shorelines and special features that he missed in going through the Aleutians the first time. So that's what he's going to be doing with the new NPRB project. And this helps us out because when we go and multiply those density estimates times the survey area, we're going to get better estimates. And we know there's a lot of imprecision in the bathymetry coverage that we have now, but we will be updating it in the future. And we can use it for more interpretation, and Matt will be talking about that in just a bit. Another thing that the bathymetry data really underscores is mapping out where fish live. And Chris Rupert is a scientist that works in the group, and he has been studying initially he was on the Alaska Deep Sea Coral and Sponge Initiative. And he used bottom trawl survey data. As I said, we capture corals and sponges. And he used that as a predictor variable to identify how habitat features like depth or the slope of the depth or latitude and longitude and temperature, how they best predict coral and sponge abundance. And he actually did that very successfully. He's published some, or he's publishing work on that and the work that he did up on the eastern Bering Sea slope. And he's taken that and used it on all of those managed fish species to redescribe essential fish habitat. And NOAA is charged with every 5 years of updating where we can identify essential fish habitat. And so the depth gradients that Mark has identified and the trawl survey data are major inputs to redefining the essential fish habitat. And those are going to be coming out here in the next few months. They're in review right now, so they're still preliminary data. But you can use features like a longitude. We know the passes for some species and the Aleutians are very important. So the model predicts that if you're in a pass and you're in the right depth zone, you have the right temperature regime, you should get this amount of fish. And you can make maps from this. So the brighter the blue color, or the brighter the color, the more the predicted fish density is, and there'll be maps available from the essential fish habitat redescription, which will be out probably at the end of the year next year, early next year. So that's been a big use of several data sources that are important, that are the trawl survey or we use for the trawl survey. So a lot of these data are available to you. You can go to the Alaska Fisheries Science Center website, and I don't know if we have a mechanism to maybe collect up some of these websites that people can refer to. But as I said, the catch and effort data are available on the website. There's a mapping utility. There are data reports, and then the SAFE documents are available on the web as well. And if you're really into the data and you have a specific need, you can hook into the Alaska Fisheries Information Network, ACFIN, and get more direct access to the trawl survey data and the estimates. And I think that's it. Yeah. Question in the back there, right behind you.